Nothing unsettles an avoidant more deeply than watching you finally turn your attention back toward yourself. This matters because you may have spent so much time protecting someone else's feelings that you forgot how much your own heart was hurting. When you stop placing them on a pedestal, stop chasing after their distance, and begin treating your own peace as something valuable, you are not simply walking away from them, you are changing the entire dynamic. For the first time, they can no longer rely on the same version of you always being available, and that change can force them to notice what they previously took for granted. It is not about making them suffer or trying to control their emotions. It is about refusing to participate in a pattern where your love is expected while their effort remains optional. You have to recognize what was happening beneath the surface because it changes how you understand everything you experienced with them. You are not trying to break them emotionally, hurt their confidence, or teach them some cruel lesson. You are simply stepping away from a pattern that allowed them to remain comfortable without truly showing up. Somewhere along the way, they may have developed an expectation that they could offer very little and still receive your complete attention. They could disappear when things became emotionally intense and assume you would remain nearby. They could be affectionate one day and distant the next, leaving you confused and constantly trying to figure out what version of them you would meet. Without realizing it, you kept adjusting yourself around their behavior, changing your expectations, suppressing your needs, and doing everything possible to prevent the connection from slipping away. For a long time, you may have participated in that pattern without even recognizing what it was costing you. You answered quickly while they took their time responding. You remembered their wounds, their fears, their past experiences, and every reason they might struggle with closeness, while your own emotional exhaustion received very little attention. You kept telling yourself that they were not intentionally hurting you. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe intimacy frightened them. Maybe they simply needed more time to feel safe. And your understanding may have been genuine, but there comes a point where understanding someone else's pain begins to require you to ignore your own. Every time you accepted treatment that left you feeling unwanted, every time you stayed quiet about something that hurt you just to avoid conflict, and every time you welcomed them back without expecting consistency, you reinforce the idea that nothing really had to change. The real shift does not happen because you suddenly become cruel, cold, or determined to get revenge. It does not require you to insult them, provoke jealousy, or disappear just to make them panic. Those things only keep you emotionally tied to the same dynamic in a different form. The deeper change happens when you stop making excuses for behavior that repeatedly hurts you. You stop falling in love with the person you hope they will eventually become and begin paying attention to the person standing in front of you right now. You stop measuring their potential and start observing their actions. You stop asking how you can make them comfortable enough to choose you and start asking whether the relationship itself is giving you the consistency, respect, and emotional security you need. That is when the old pattern begins losing its power, because you are no longer helping it survive. There is something powerful about no longer trying to convince someone to recognize your value. You do not have to announce that you are choosing yourself. Your behavior communicates it naturally. You become less reactive to their silence. You stop checking your phone every few minutes, wondering whether their next message will finally bring the reassurance you've been waiting for. You stop interpreting every small gesture as proof that everything is changing. Instead, you become grounded in what you can actually see. If they want to be present, they have to show it through consistency. If they want closeness, they have to participate in creating it. If they care about keeping you in their life, they cannot continue expecting you to carry the entire emotional weight of the connection. Your self-respect quietly changes the rules because you are no longer willing to trade your peace for temporary moments of attention. And this is often where something inside the avoidant can begin to shift. When you were constantly available, your presence may have felt guaranteed. They could withdraw and still know you were emotionally waiting for them. They could create distance and assume the connection would remain exactly where they left it. But when you stop organizing your life around their movements, that certainty disappears. They may begin noticing your absence in places where they once assumed your attention would always be waiting. They may start remembering conversations differently. They may realize how much emotional support, patience, and understanding you were quietly providing. This does not automatically mean they will become secure or suddenly know how to love perfectly, but it can create a moment of awareness. They are no longer interacting with the version of you who will endlessly tolerate uncertainty just to keep the relationship alive. That is why choosing yourself should never be confused with trying to manipulate an avoidant into chasing you. Your goal is not to make them afraid of losing you so they finally give you attention. Your goal is to become so connected to your own worth that their reaction is no longer the measure of your success. If they come closer, you observe whether their actions have genuinely changed. If they remain distant, you continue moving forward instead of collapsing back into old patterns. You are no longer waiting for someone else's emotional awakening before giving yourself permission to live peacefully. And ironically, that is often the very change that makes your presence feel different to them. You are no longer standing there asking to be chosen. You are becoming someone who knows that being chosen means very little when the relationship still requires you to abandon yourself. This is the point where you can look at their charm, their silence, and the little pieces of effort they offer and suddenly feel something different inside yourself. It is not rage, it is recognition. You begin seeing the pattern for what it actually is. They may have learned that a sweet message, an affectionate photo, or a gentle apology can quickly erase the tension without requiring them to truly change anything. In the past, those small gestures may have been enough to soften you. Your frustration would disappear because you would suddenly see the person you missed, and that emotional relief would pull you back in. You would think, maybe this time is different, maybe they finally understand. But then the same pattern would return. Their distance would create pain, their charm would create relief, and you would become emotionally attached to the relief itself. That cycle allowed them to remain comfortable without changing. Their sense of security often depends on believing that they can control how close the relationship becomes. When intimacy starts feeling overwhelming, they can step away and create distance. Then, when the loneliness becomes uncomfortable, or they begin missing the emotional connection, they can return and expect the door to still be open. The problem is not simply that they leave and come back. It is that the pattern can continue without requiring them to seriously examine what their behavior does to you. If you repeatedly welcome them back without any meaningful change, they may assume the connection will always survive their withdrawal. They learn that they can disappear when closeness feels threatening and return when they want comfort again. And because you are often willing to understand their fears, they may never have had to fully confront the consequences of their inconsistency. But something changes when you stop responding to the surface-level gestures that once pulled you back in. You may still recognize their charm. You may still appreciate a sweet message or feel something when they suddenly become affectionate. The difference is that you no longer confuse a moment of attention with evidence of transformation. They can appear exactly as they always did, but your internal response is different. You do not immediately become excited. You do not rush to restore the connection. You do not allow one emotional moment to erase everything that happened before it. You start watching what happens after the apology, after the message, after the affectionate moment. Does their behavior remain consistent? Do they communicate differently? Do they take responsibility? Or does the same distance eventually return once they feel secure again? That change can feel surprisingly powerful because you are no longer feeding the emotional pattern that once kept you attached. When your response becomes calmer and more measured, their old methods may stop producing the same result. This does not mean you are deliberately trying to hurt them. You are simply no longer giving automatic emotional rewards for minimal effort. There is a major difference between withholding affection as punishment and refusing to abandon yourself for temporary attention. One is manipulation. The other is self-respect. You are not trying to make them suffer because they pulled away. You are allowing their behavior to have natural consequences. If they disappear, you continue living your life. If they return with the same shallow effort, you do not immediately reopen your heart. If they want genuine closeness, they have to participate in creating something more stable. And that is where their old sense of certainty can begin to disappear. They may have become accustomed to knowing exactly what would happen whenever they returned. They would send something warm, you would soften, they would apologize, you would forgive. They would show a little vulnerability, and you would immediately become emotionally available again. Your reaction became predictable, and that predictability allowed them to remain comfortable inside the pattern. But when you stop reacting automatically, they can no longer rely on the same formula. Suddenly, the distance they once used to maintain control does not create the same effect. You are not desperately trying to decode it. You are not begging for an explanation. You are not proving that you still care. You are simply continuing with your life, and that quiet shift can make them realize that your emotional availability was never something they were entitled to. Their silence can also begin to look completely different when you stop filling it with your imagination. Before, their absence may have seemed mysterious. You might have wondered what they were thinking, whether they missed you, or whether their silence meant they were secretly struggling with deeper feelings. You gave their withdrawal layers of meaning because you were emotionally invested in understanding them. But when you become grounded, silence becomes information instead of a puzzle. If someone chooses not to communicate, you notice that choice. If someone repeatedly disappears whenever vulnerability enters the relationship, you recognize the pattern. Their distance no longer automatically makes them fascinating or emotionally complex in your eyes. Sometimes distance is simply distance. Sometimes silence is simply a lack of communication, and seeing it clearly removes the fantasy that kept you emotionally waiting. The same thing happens with the little pieces of affection they once used to keep the connection alive. A small amount of attention may have felt incredibly meaningful when you were starving for reassurance. One loving message could make you forget an entire week of confusion. One affectionate moment could convince you that the deeper relationship was still there underneath everything. But once you begin valuing consistency, those moments lose their ability to overwhelm your judgment. You start asking whether the love exists beyond isolated moments. You start noticing whether affection is supported by reliability, honesty, emotional presence, and genuine effort. That is a major internal shift because you are no longer measuring love by intensity. You are measuring it by what repeatedly happens when the excitement fades and real emotional responsibility is required. And this is the reality their ego may struggle with the most. They may have believed that their absence made them more desirable, their mystery made them more powerful, and their occasional affection made them impossible to forget. But when you stop chasing what is inconsistent, those things can lose their influence. Their silence no longer automatically pulls you closer. Their charm no longer erases everything that came before it. Their occasional effort no longer convinces you that you should accept an entire relationship built around uncertainty. You begin seeing them as a whole person rather than the idealized version your heart created during the good moments. And when that happens, their power over your emotions starts disappearing. What once felt unforgettable can simply become something you recognize, understand, and finally know how to walk away from if it continues costing you your peace. What makes this pattern so difficult to break is that it rarely looks harmful in the beginning. It often feels like chemistry, hope, or a connection that just needs a little more patience. The charm is not always fake, and that is what makes it so confusing. They may genuinely care in certain moments, genuinely miss you, and genuinely feel affection when they return. But genuine feelings do not automatically create healthy behavior. A person can mean what they say in one moment and still repeat the same patterns afterward. This is why charm becomes so powerful. It creates an emotional memory that feels stronger than the disappointment. You remember how they made you feel when they were warm, and that memory can keep you waiting through the periods when they become distant, hoping the version you loved will return again. The silence can become just as emotionally powerful because the human mind naturally tries to fill in what it does not understand. When someone suddenly pulls away, your thoughts may start searching for explanations. Maybe they are overwhelmed. Maybe they are afraid. Maybe they need space. Maybe they are secretly thinking about you. This constant searching keeps you emotionally connected even when they are absent. Instead of receiving clarity from them, you create possibilities in your own mind. Over time, their silence begins to occupy more emotional space than their actual presence. You spend more time thinking about what they might mean than noticing what they are actually doing. And that is why learning to see silence as information rather than a mystery can feel so freeing. It allows you to stop chasing answers that someone else has chosen not to give. Half effort is especially difficult because it is not the same as no effort. If someone gave you absolutely nothing, it might be easier to walk away. But when they occasionally show affection, remember something important, or make a small gesture after being distant, it creates hope. That hope can keep you invested far longer than consistent rejection ever could. You begin telling yourself that they are trying, even when the overall pattern remains unchanged. Small moments of attention start carrying enormous emotional weight because they arrive after periods of uncertainty. What should feel normal begins to feel extraordinary simply because it is rare. Over time, you can find yourself grateful for things that would never have felt sufficient in a balanced relationship, simply because you have become accustomed to receiving so little. This is where the emotional cycle becomes so strong. The distance creates anxiety, the return creates relief, and the relief feels so powerful that it can be mistaken for love. Your nervous system begins associating their return with safety because it ends the discomfort their absence created. That does not mean your feelings are not real. It means the emotional highs and lows can become deeply intertwined with your attachment to them. You may find yourself missing not only the person, but also the feeling of relief when they finally come back. Breaking this cycle requires learning to tolerate the discomfort without immediately seeking reassurance from the same person who created the uncertainty. Slowly, you begin discovering that peace feels different from emotional intensity, but over time, peace becomes far more valuable than the temporary excitement of being chosen again. When people talk about the ego in situations like this, they are not necessarily describing arrogance or selfishness. The ego is often the part of a person that protects their sense of identity and emotional safety. If someone has become comfortable believing that they can always return and still be welcomed exactly the same way, your changed behavior can challenge that belief. They may feel unsettled because something they relied on is no longer guaranteed. That discomfort does not mean you have harmed them. It simply means they are being confronted with a reality they did not have to face before. Healthy relationships require both people to adapt, communicate, and take responsibility. When one person has always carried the emotional burden, balance can feel threatening simply because it is unfamiliar. The illusion that begins to fall apart is the belief that love will remain available regardless of behavior. Many people, not just avoidants, can become comfortable when they believe another person's loyalty has no limits. They stop noticing the patience being offered because it feels permanent. But when that patience becomes self-respect, the relationship changes. Suddenly, attention has to be earned through consistency rather than assumed through history. This is not about making someone chase you or creating insecurity on purpose. It is about allowing relationships to reflect reality. If someone wants closeness, they have to contribute to closeness. If they want trust, they have to behave in ways that build trust. Love can be compassionate, but compassion does not require you to ignore repeated patterns that leave you feeling emotionally unsafe. The deepest transformation happens inside you rather than inside them. At first, you may hope that your changed behavior will finally make them understand what they have been losing, and perhaps it will. But eventually, that becomes less important. You stop measuring your progress by whether they miss you, whether they return, or whether they finally recognize your value. You begin noticing your own emotional stability instead. You realize you are sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and no longer spending entire days waiting for a message that may or may not come. Their charm still exists, their silence still exists, and their occasional affection may still stir emotions. But those things no longer control your sense of worth. You are no longer trying to become unforgettable to them. You are becoming someone who no longer forgets themselves just to keep another person close. At the end of all of this, the greatest shift is not that the avoidant finally notices you. The greatest shift is that you finally notice yourself. You stop measuring your worth by how intensely someone wants you, how quickly they return, or how deeply they react when you pull away. You understand that your value was never created by their attention, and it cannot be destroyed by their distance. Choosing yourself means you no longer accept confusion simply because it comes with chemistry. You no longer call inconsistency love just because the good moments feel powerful. You begin understanding that real connection should not require you to constantly abandon your needs just to keep someone comfortable. Your peace becomes more important than their temporary approval, and that is when the entire dynamic begins to lose its control over you. If they truly care about you, your self-respect will not destroy the connection. It will reveal whether there is something real enough to build. They may come closer, communicate more honestly, or finally recognize that your presence was never something they could take for granted. But whether they return or remain distant is no longer the center of your world. You are no longer waiting for their emotional awakening to begin your own healing. You are moving forward because you have finally understood that love should not require you to chase, convince, tolerate, and endlessly wait. The strongest message you can send is not through silence, revenge, or manipulation. It is through the life you build when you stop abandoning yourself. And once you reach that place, you realize you did not lose them by choosing yourself. You finally stop losing yourself trying to keep them.